Hey folks, in this video I'm going to show you how to get started with Flexbox as a beginner. Flexbox is a really powerful CSS feature that lets you size and align groups of elements. So I'm starting with VS Code on the left here, and then I have the local website running on the right. Now with Flexbox, you need to have a parent element, and this is going to be the Flex container, and it's going to contain direct child elements inside it that are going to be the Flex child items. So let's start creating this in our markup. I'm going to create the parent div with the class of Flex parent. Then inside it, I'm going to create another div and give it a class of Flex child. And I'm also going to add some text content. We'll just say Flex child. And I want to duplicate the Flex child a few times. And let's number them so we can tell them apart. There we go. So now we have our elements, and let's also add some styles. So I already have some global styles for the body background color, and then adding a little bit of padding to all the divs so they don't look too cramped. Let's also target our Flex parent. And I'm going to give it a background color so we can sort of distinguish it from the children better. And then the same with the Flex child elements. Let's add a background color of dark blue. There we go. So now we have our gray parent div, and it contains the blue child divs. And at the moment, the child divs are displayed as block elements because they're divs, one after another in the normal flow. So now let's start adding Flexbox and see how things change. So in Flexbox, there are some CSS properties that you set on the Flex parent, and then there are other properties that you set on the Flex child items themselves. So to create a Flex container, I want to target the parent element and set its display value to Flex. So when we save, doing this has transformed the parent into a Flex container. And you can see this has changed how the Flex child items inside it are displayed. Before they were following the normal flow with the block layout, but now they have been changed into the Flexbox layout mode. Turning on Flexbox mode is going to unlock a whole lot of other Flexbox properties to control how these child items are going to be displayed. So one thing we can also do is add space between the Flex child items using the gap property, which is set on the parent. So if I set gap to 10 pixels, then there's going to be 10 pixels of space between the Flex child items. And it's not going to add any space on the far left and far right sides, only between two Flex child items. Now, creating a Flex container using display Flex like we did, it's going to align all the Flex child items along an axis. This is called the main axis. And by default, the main axis is going to run horizontally, putting the items in a row, starting from the left and ending on the right. In CSS, this is set with the Flex direction property, and its default value is row. Now you can also set Flex direction to other values. If we set it to row reverse, now the Flex child items are still in a row, but it starts on the right side with Flex child 1, and then it ends on the left. And you can even put the Flex child items into columns. So if I set the Flex direction to column, this flips the main axis from running in a horizontal direction to now running in a vertical direction, starting from the top and ending at the bottom. And similarly, we can also set it to column reverse so that the main axis runs from the bottom up to the top. So I'm going to delete this so we go back to the default Flex direction of row. Now, in addition to the main axis, which is horizontal by default, there's also what's called the cross axis. This is perpendicular to the main axis. And by default, the cross axis is vertical because it's perpendicular to the horizontal main axis. And knowing which direction your main and cross axes are running in is very important, especially when it comes to aligning the Flex child items, which we'll be getting into later. So right now, we can easily fit all of the Flex child items in a row inside the Flex parent, and we even have a little bit of space left over. However, let's see what happens when I duplicate the Flex child divs so that we have 8 items instead of 4. So the Flex parent is still going to put all of the Flex child items into the same row and try to make them all fit by wrapping the text inside them so they get narrower. But as you can see, there still isn't quite enough room for all of them to fit on the same row, so this is making the Flex child items overflow, which is causing horizontal scrolling. Now to fix this, you can allow the Flex child items to wrap to a new row when necessary by setting Flex Wrap on the parent and set it to wrap. So now the Flex children are allowed to wrap to multiple lines. By default, Flex Wrap is set to no wrap, and this is what forces all of the children to be on the same row. Now, if you ever get stuck when you're working with Flexbox, you can use the browser developer tools to help figure out what's going on. So I'm using Firefox, and it has some really great Flexbox inspection tools. I'm going to right-click anywhere in the Flex container and then hit Inspect. So in the source code panel at the top, let's go up to the Flex parent. And you can see that it has this label or chip that says Flex. This indicates that this div is a Flex container. And if I click it, it's going to turn on Flexbox highlighting, and we can now see lines on our website. So we can actually see more if we go into the Layout tab. And you just want to make sure you have the Flex parent selected. And you can see now that it tells you that it's a Flex container. You can do things like toggle the highlighting on and off here. You can even change the color of the highlighting if you want. And it's also telling us that the Flex direction is row and that wrapping is turned on. And below this, it also tells you each of the Flex child items in the Flex container. You can hover over each of them and see where they are in the actual website. And later on in this video, I'm going to show you some more inspection tools that comes in handy for these Flex children. Now with our Flexbox highlighting turned on, we can see the overall size of the Flex container, and there are solid lines around each row, as well as around each of the Flex child items. Then we have the gap spaces between the Flex child items kind of shaded here, and there's also extra space which is shaded as well. Now, one note about the gap property that we set on the Flex parent. Gap is actually a shorthand property. It's made up of row gap and column gap. So row gap is the space between rows, and column gap is the space between columns. So let's say if we want to have a different amount of space, let's say we wanted to have 20 pixels of space between the rows, we can add 20 pixels to gap. So now we have 20 pixels of space between the rows, and then we still have that 10 pixels of space between the columns. Now, because we have some extra width available on each of the rows in the Flex container, we can align the Flex child items in different ways along that horizontal main axis to distribute that extra space in different ways. We can do this with the Justify Content property on the Flex parent. Now by default, it's going to be set to Flex Start or Start, which kind of do the same thing. And that's going to align the Flex child items on the left side. So we can also set Justify Content to Flex End or End to align them instead to the right side, which is the end of the main axis. Now, one thing that we want to note with Flexbox is that there are no strict column or row sizes like you see with CSS Grid. Everything in Flexbox is based around the size of the Flex child items themselves. So right now they're all the same size because their text content is the same size. But let's make some of them a little bit bigger. So I'm going to copy that Flex child 2 text, and let's just paste it in a few times to make it bigger. And let's do the same thing to the 6th one. So now the items with more text are bigger, and this is going to cause the Flex child items to wrap differently than they were before. And with flex start, they're all aligned flush to the left side as well as to each other. So all the space on each row is going to be on the right side. Now we can also set justify content to center. And doing this is going to make the items on each row centered inside that row with extra space equal on both left and right sides. I often set justify content to space between. This is going to align the flex child items flush to both the left and the right sides, and then the extra space is going to be distributed between them. You can also set justify content to space around. This is going to divide the space between the items equally, and then there's going to be half as much space on the left and the right edges. And then you can also set it to space evenly to have the same amount of space both between and around the items on each row. And you might notice that it is very slightly different, especially on the second row. This is kind of thrown off by the gap space that we added between the flex items. So if you want the spaces to be exactly the same, then you can set the column gap to 0. So now these spaces are exactly the same. However, the vast majority of the time, I'm going to use either space between or center. So let's just leave it set at centered. Okay, so that's the justify content property. So justify means aligning the flex child items along the main axis, which in this case is horizontal, and then content meaning that you're aligning all the flex child items together as a group inside the flex container. Next, you can use the align items property to align each of the flex child items along the cross axis. In our case here, since our flex direction is row or horizontal, the cross axis is vertical. Align items can be very useful when your flex child items are at different heights. So just to make this more clear, I'm going to select the nth child, 3, flex child, and I'm going to give it a background color of dark magenta, and then a static height of 60 pixels. There we go. So now it is taller than it was before, and you might notice that it is also affecting the height of the other 2 flex child items in that same row. Now the reason for this is because align items is by default set to stretch, which makes all of the flex child items in a row the same height as each other. And this property is set on the flex parent. We can also set align items to start or flex start. This is going to vertically align each child to the top of the row if there's extra space. We can also do end or flex end to align them to the bottom. And of course, what most people like to do is to use align items center to vertically center the flex child items. Now, the reason that this is called align items is because it aligns all the child items individually within their own space, as you can see here. And you can also individually align flex child items using the align self property set on the flex child selector. All right, so I'm going to target the first child. We'll say nth child 1, and here I'm going to set align self to flex end. So now you can see the first child is aligned to the end of the cross axis, which is the bottom. So these 2 properties that we've talked about so far, justify content and align items, are what you're going to be using by far the most frequently to align Flexbox child items, both horizontally and vertically. There is also the align content property, but in my experience, I don't use that as much. However, if you have extra height in the flex container, then you can use align content to align the flex children as a group along the vertical cross axis. So let's see how this looks. I'm going to go back to the parent, and I'm going to set height of the parent to 500 pixels. So when we save, you can see the flex container is a lot taller, and by default, the extra vertical space is going to be divided equally among the rows. Now, if I set align content to flex start, this is going to align all of the flex child items as a group to the start side of the cross axis, meaning the top side. And all the extra space is now at the bottom. And we can also set it to flex end to push all of the items to the bottom, or of course we can do align content center to center them vertically. And you might note that in that first row, we do still have that extra space around the first child and the second child. And this is because of the height that we set on that third child. So align content is not going to affect the extra space of each individual child. It affects the rows as a whole. So hopefully this helps explain how properties with the word content will align the children as a group, and then properties with the word items are going to align each child individually in their own area. And another thing to note, there is no justify items or justify self in Flexbox, because along the main axis, which is by default horizontally, you are going to be treating the flex child items and any extra space in that row as a group, not individually. And this is a little bit different with CSS Grid, as we'll see later on in this series. Now, one of the trickiest parts of Flexbox is remembering what justify and align mean when you change the flex direction to column. So let's see what this looks like in our styles. I'm going to remove all the alignment styles. And let's change the flex direction to column. So this flips the main axis to now the vertical direction. And because the default value of align items is stretch, this is stretching the width of the flex child items out now. Now let's say we wanted to horizontally center the flex child items. If we say justify content, center, this is going to instead vertically align the flex child items because justify content aligns them along the main axis, which is now vertical. So if we want to horizontally center, we need to say align items center. So now horizontally, each flex child item is centered within its space. So just remember that if you flip the main axis in Flexbox to vertical or column, you'll also need to switch what justify content and align items do in your head, which is kind of hard to remember. All right, so we've mainly been looking at Flexbox properties that we set on the parent, the Flex container. Now let's also look at properties that we can set on the Flex child items in order to size them. So first, let's simplify our website code. I'm going to go to our HTML, and I'm going to comment out all the flex child items except the first three. Then let's go into our styles, and I'm going to delete the height, also the wrapping, and the alignment styles. And let's simplify the children as well. Delete the height there, and then we don't need this. And let's make the second child the magenta one. So now when we save, we have our flex container with 3 flex child items, and they are sized based on their content. Flex child 2 has more text content, so it's taking up more space in the row. Now in Flexbox, you can control the size of the flex child items using the properties flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. And we can see the default styles for these by right-clicking, going to the inspector, and to see default browser styles, we can go to the Computed tab and check this browser styles checkbox to show all the default browser styles. And because there's so many styles here, let's filter for flex. So right now we have flex grow, which is set to 0. This means that the flex child items are not going to grow larger than their original size. Then we have flex shrink, which by default is set to 1. This will allow the flex child items to shrink in order to fit on the row if necessary. And then we have flex basis, which is set to auto. This means that they'll be sized according to their original size based on their content. And you can also set flex basis to a static number. The flex basis is the base size of the flex child item, and then it can grow or shrink to fit depending on the values that you have for flex grow and flex shrink. So just in our browser styles, let's go to the flex child styles and let's set flex basis to a static number of 100 pixels. So now all the flex child items are the same size because their base size from flex spaces is 100 pixels instead of being based on the size of their content. So in the source code, just make sure we have the second flex child selected, and let's check out the Flexbox inspection tools. So I'm going to go to the layout tab here, and here it says flex item of the flex parent div, and it gives us some information about how this second child is sized. So at the moment, we can see the base size is set to 100 pixels from that flex basis style that we had, but that's just a temporary style. So let's reload to remove that and go back to the default styles. And now it is based on the content size again, which is based on the text content. Now currently it is not shrinking because there is enough room. However, if we go back into our code, and I'm just going to make flex child 2 longer again. There we go. Then if we go back to our dev tools, and sometimes it kind of bugs out with the highlighting, so you just have to click the label to show the highlighting again. And again, we're on the flex child 2. And now it says the content size is 380. And under flexibility, it says it has a flex shrink value of 1, which is again the default. And in order to fit all the 3 divs on the same row, it is shrinking. So it's shrinking by 110 pixels. Then we have the final size down here, which is the content size minus the amount that it has shrunk. And one quick note, I do recommend that you allow flex items to shrink unless you specifically don't want them to shrink, just because allowing them to shrink will help prevent horizontal overflow and horizontal scrolling. You can see this in the rules. If on all the flex child items, I add flex shrink and I set it to 0, now we have horizontal scrolling because they are overflowing, because they're not allowed to shrink to fit. So I do recommend just keeping flex shrink to 1. All right, so I'm going to reload just to make sure we go back to our saved styles. And if we go back to the layout tab and click one of the smaller flex child items, we can see that the content size, if we scoot this up a little bit, is smaller than the second one, again, because they have less text content. Now, when you're working with Flexbox, a lot of the time you are going to want to make all the flex child items the same size. So if we go into our styles, the recommended way to make all the flex children the same size is to add the flex property and set it to 1. So now all the flex child items are the same width. Now the flex property is the shorthand property for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis all in one property. So if I inspect the rules, we can see our flex 1 style rule, and if we expand it, we can see we have different values for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. So when you use just one number for the flex shorthand property, that number is going to be applied to flex grow. And giving all the 3 flex child items the same flex grow number of 1 is going to make them grow the same size amount from their flex basis size. And in terms of flex basis, you might notice that it's been automatically set to 0% when we set the flex property. This is just a default behavior in the browser to help make Flexbox less weird in terms of its behavior. So flex basis of 0% is going to change the flex basis from the default value of auto, which is the content size, to now 0. And this will ensure that all the flex children are going to start from the same place, grow the same amount, and ultimately be the same size. So if I go to the layout tab again, we can see that things look a little bit different. The content size is 0 because of that flex basis of 0. And then in flexibility, it tells us how much the item grew and then the final size. And if I select the other flex children, they have pretty much the same values as each other. Now, what if we wanted the second flex child item, the magenta one, to be larger than the other 2? What we could do is in the nth child 2 selector, give it a different value for flex and let's give it a value of 2. So now the second child is larger than the other, although it's not quite double the width, which you might expect, setting flex of 2 on that one and the others have flex of 1. But let's see what the flex property is actually doing. If we inspect the second flex child, we can see that it has a flexibility allowed to grow. So it's growing 186 pixels. And let's check on the other ones. The other ones are growing half of that. They're growing 93 pixels. But one really big thing to note is that Flexbox sizing, so anything with flex grow, flex shrink, and flex spaces, it's only going to affect the content size, meaning the content box from the box model. So the Flexbox styles are not going to take into account padding or border. So if we go into the box model, we can see the final size of each of the divs that does include padding and border. So if I select one of the smaller divs here, we have a final size of 133 pixels. And then if I go to the bigger FlexChild 2 div, that one is 226 or 7. So 226 versus 133. The second child is less than double the size of the other ones, and that is because of that 20 pixels of padding that we've added to all the divs. So essentially, every div is getting 40 pixels of additional width from that 20 pixels of padding, and that is added after all the flex sizing happens. So again, just keep in mind that any flex growing or flex shrinking is only going to affect the content box. Okay, so that's how sizing the flex child items works. But let me also show you how adding the flex 1 or the flex 2 style is going to affect the size of the items when we have more of them. So I'm going to go back to our HTML and I'm going to uncomment the other divs so we have multiple ones. And let's turn back on flex wrap and set it to wrap to allow them to wrap to multiple lines. So now we have all of the 8 flex children. They're wrapping to multiple rows, and because they all are either set to flex 1 or flex 2, they're allowed to grow to fill the available space. So if I comment out the flex properties, you can see that they are stuck to their original space based on the content. So now they are allowed to grow to fill the available space, which is oftentimes what people want. So one big thing that Flexbox does compared to Grid is that there's no template of specifically sized columns and rows. Flexbox is just trying to fit all the children according to the styles that we've set. So the rows and columns are not strictly sized. You can see the rows are different sizes from each other. What you might call columns in Flexbox are also sized differently from each other. There is no strict template like we have with Grid. So this is a really big difference between them. I would say this is what helps me determine if I use Flexbox or Grid. I choose Flexbox when I don't care about having a strict template, and I really just want to fit all the FlexChild items into one or more rows or columns. And you'll see more how Grid differentiates in the next video when we get to that. But one last thing before we go that I wanted to mention is that you can change the order of FlexChild items in the container. Now, by default, the order property on each child is set to 0. So let's say I wanted to make the magenta, the FlexChild 2, the first in the order. What I can do is set order, and I want it to be less than 0, so I can say -1. So now it's going to be first in the order. And if I want to make it last, I can make it a greater number than 0, and if I set it to 1, then it's now going to be last, again because the others are defaulting to order of 0. So that's how you can control the order of items in Flexbox. One thing just to note for accessibility is that you want to be careful not to change the order too different from the original order that you have in your markup, just because it can cause confusion for people who might be using accessibility tools like screen readers to navigate your website. So that's the basics of Flexbox for beginners. Next up, we're going to be taking a look at CSS Grid.